Residential Resilient Action Team meeting. And last time we spoke, we were talking about different options for something new. But what we realized is that we were talking about options without knowing the various problems we need to solve for. So today we're going to talk about these known and developing options. We will start to talk about what the task force would like to propose, and then share a few options for discussion on how we might solve the city's flood issues. Next slide, please. So our agenda slide is pretty clear. The times are going to get adjusted, and I promise it'll all work out without everybody having to talk super fast. So next slide, please. So as always, for those of you that are new to the call and the public that hopefully will be joining us if they haven't already started to join us already, here's a brief summary of how the task force came to be. It was established by the city administrator in September of 21. We had a kickoff meeting with the full task force in November of 21. And then we want to make sure everyone knows that the proceedings are open to the public. All task force and action team meetings are in the public space. And information about this, all of the meeting agenda, meeting minutes, and posting are on the website, which is www.dcfloodtaskforce.org, and that's dcfloodtaskforce.org. And we also will have some separate public listening sessions that start in the month of March, which is next month, and we'll share a little bit more about that later in the presentation today. Next slide, please. And so the task force schedule is pretty simple. Phil Barlow, thank you so much for updating with that feedback information. We will put on the website the actual times for the meetings because they are set. So for the flood task force, tongue twister, every other month we meet on the third Wednesday. And the next meeting for the full task force would be March 16th. And then we have our action team meetings every month. For residential resilience, that's the second Tuesday of the month. For governance and coordination, it's the second Friday of the month. The flood task force will have a final report that's due in November 2022, and it will have a plan for each of the 9 categories that we discuss on a regular basis. The post-final report of the flood task force meeting the post-final report will be submitted, and then we'll have some annual meeting to track the progress of the action plan and continue to discuss budget and action plan priorities. Next slide, please. As I said before, we have 2 action teams with 9 categories. Residential resilience has 1 through 4. Governance and coordinations has 5 through 9. And on Friday, February 11th at 9:30 a.m., we will have our next governance and coordination meeting. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to ask Salil. Martin Cutt. We're going to have a presentation by Martin. He's going to level set us on what this NFIP program is. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks. So the National Flood Insurance Program is a federal program that provides flood insurance coverage to homes and businesses in the United States. The NFIP was developed in the 1970s. During that time, there was very limited private flood insurance coverage, so the federal government stepped in to help mitigate disaster losses. NFIP coverage is specifically required by mortgage lenders for all properties that are used as collateral for federally backed mortgages in the 100-year floodplain. However, NFIP coverage is available for almost all properties, regardless of flood zone or mortgage status. Policies are available for homes, both the structure and contents, businesses, both the structure and contents, and renters can purchase coverage for their contents within a rental unit. NFIP policies make up most of the flood insurance policies in the district. There is relatively limited data available on private flood insurance policies in DC. Those are very new to the market. They were released nationwide within only the past 5 or 10 years. So we're still learning more about those. One benefit that we have identified is some of the private policies do provide loss of use coverage, which is not available through the NFIP. Next slide, please. Flood insurance does cover a building, and for a residential building, the coverage limit goes up to $250,000. This coverage protects the building itself, for instance, the frame, drywall, foundation, etc. It also covers built-in appliances, HVAC systems, hot water heaters, permanent furnishings, as well as plumbing components. Note that all of these coverages apply to areas of a home that are above grade. Coverage in basement areas is limited to HVAC systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems, and the structural components of the foundation. So it's important to note, given the number of basement residences in DC, that the NFIP only covers items in basements that are strictly necessary to make the property habitable. It doesn't cover many of the improvements. Next slide. Oh, next slide, please. In terms of personal contents, the NFIP policies cover furniture, electronics, clothing, and other valuables. Note that there is a $2,500 limit on art, jewelry, and collectibles. For contents that are located above grade, so outside of a basement, this contents coverage does include AC units, the portable or window AC, permanently installed carpeting, the big ticket items like washer dryers, microwaves, dishwashers, and even barbecue grills. Other coverages from the NFIP include cleanup costs and debris removal, as well as $1,000 for moving property out of harm's way before a flood, or using sandbags or other equipment to protect it before a flood. Next. No, thanks. Currently, there are about 2,000 NFIP policies in effect in the district. However, these policies are not necessarily distributed where they would be most effective. 83% of the NFIP policies in the district are for properties in the X zone, which is a moderate to low risk area. In the 100-year flood zone, which is the highest risk category, also known as the special flood hazard area, that area makes up only 17% of NFIP policies in the district. So why is that? Well, one reason is that a key driver of purchasing flood insurance is the federal mandate. The FDIC mandates that lenders force mortgage holders to purchase flood insurance if they are using their property as collateral for a mortgage and it's located in the 100-year floodplain. But only 22% of households in census tracts of wards 7 and 8 that intersect the floodplain have a mortgage. So the remaining households, their choice on whether or not to purchase flood insurance would be a matter of their own personal discretion. And also note that we highlight wards 7 and 8 here because those wards are home to over 90% of the residential buildings in the floodplain. DC does have a relatively high proportion of renters compared to communities nationwide, but only 1% of the NFIP policies in the district are contents-only policies for renters. Next slide. The cost of coverage is another factor in limiting the distribution of the NFIP policies where they are needed most. The average annual premium for policies in that special flood hazard area, the 100-year floodplain, is about $3,000. For properties in the X zone, which is the low to moderate risk area, those policies have a premium of about $430 per year. There's also a preferred risk policy that is phasing out this year due to risk rating 2.0. That was available for properties with a relatively favorable loss history, and that was an average annual premium of $350. Risk rating 2.0 does erase some of the zone distinctions in terms of premium pricing. Risk rating 2.0 looks at more holistic factors of a property, such as the height of the first floor above grade, replacement cost value, loss history, and other factors. So risk rating 2.0 will reduce flood insurance premiums in the district based on compared to the prior rating system. Moving from the prior rating system to risk rating 2.0, 74% of policyholders in the district will save money. And over 1 in 5 policyholders in wards 7 and 8 will save over $100 per month. However, the long-term trends with risk rating 2.0 are uncertain. So premium increases are capped at 18% per year for primary residences, but that means that the premium can increase by 18% per year, year over year. Next slide. Since 1977 until January 2021, about 440 NFIP claims have been filed in the district for a total of about $4.6 million. Note that 64% of these claims have been in the X or low risk flood zone. There is a misconception about flood insurance that flood insurance is not necessary for an individual property because in the event of a major flood, FEMA will step in and provide individual assistance or IA payments to affected residents. However, that may not be the case. The IA threshold for the District of Columbia is approximately $2 million. So before a flood would reach the damage threshold for those individual payments, that flood would have to cause as much damage in one event as all of the floods in the district since 1977. Just for comparison, in 2016, FEMA paid about $5 million on just 27 flood insurance claims in Ellicott City, Maryland. And you may have seen the videos of the severe flooding there. So a lot of the flooding in the district is very impactful to individual residents. If your basement is destroyed, if you have to spend $5,000 or $10,000 to repair it, that's very severe for you, but the overall magnitude of the flood events for the city has been relatively limited, fortunately. Next slide.
Thank you, Martin. Great bit of information. I've wrote down a couple of notes myself, so I'm sure that will contribute to further conversation as we go deeper into our meeting today. So with that, Salil, could you please present the next few slides about what isn't working with existing insurance options?
Sure, Monty. Before we do, should we take any questions on Martin's section? If there are any.
Hey, Salil, this is Stephanie. Emily posted a question in the chat. She asked, Martin, if you could please repeat the statistic from slide 10. You mentioned something about 90% of homes in the floodplain, but she didn't catch the full statement.
Oh, yes. About 90%, over 90% of the residential structures in the 100-year floodplain are located in just 2 wards, Ward 7 and Ward 8. So these communities are overburdened by flood risk.
And Martin, did you say the risk rating 2.0 will reduce payments? What percent of Ward 8 would benefit from that? 7 and 8?
Yes. So in both Ward 7 and Ward 8, over 75% of policyholders will see a savings from risk rating 2.0, and over 20% of the policyholders in each of those wards will save more than $100 per month.
Thank you, Martin.
Those policies are about $3,000 a year.
Yes. So the savings, policyholders in all flood risk zones will experience, the savings statistics are aggregated, based on all of the different flood zones. But the $3,000 average annual premium is specifically for policyholders in the 100-year floodplain.
Okay. Important statistic I was not aware of. There's only 22% of Ward 7 and 8 hold mortgages. So the rest are outright ownership. Is that the understanding? 78%?
Yes, and those are specifically the properties that intersect the 100-year floodplain.
I think that's an important statistic. I mean, it's interesting, but it's also important in terms of flood insurance because flood insurance is only required if you have a federally backed mortgage, as most mortgages are. So, basically that's saying that 22%, only 22% of the houses in the floodplain in Ward 7 and Ward 8 are, potentially required to have flood insurance. So there's the 78% that either they own their home outright or some other way, but they may benefit from insurance, but they're not required to have it according to FEMA guidelines.
Yeah, but if then they're counting on equity from that, 78% counting on equity from the house, it's more important that they be able to protect it so they can recover that. Good point.
And also, if an investor purchases a property in cash and leases it to a tenant, if that property is destroyed by a flood and the landlord doesn't have insurance coverage and they can't afford to make repairs, then the tenant is without a home.
True. All great points. Thank you much.
Stella, I'm sorry, just before we leave that, I know we do need to advance, but there's two notes from Victor in the chat. An individual may have a conventional load, and also FEMA does not require flood insurance for, he said for these, but I'm sorry, he's still typing, but FEMA does not require flood insurance. For these, Victor, can you just share you can come off mute and share what doesn't it require flood insurance for as your point?
Yeah, thank you. I was just trying to add that the other 78% may also be contributed to people who did not get or just purchased their home through a conventional loan, not load. Sorry, that was a typo.
Okay. Thank you, Victor. I appreciate you making that point. Go ahead, Salo, get into your slides. Thank you.
Okay, so isn't working with existing insurance options? So using September 10th storm as a indicator, and looking at the complaints from the individual homeowners, let's look at what worked and did not work for them, right? So let's, Ormisia, are you on the call too? I'm afraid I can't see everybody's name.
Oh yeah, I'm here. Hi there. Hi, everyone.
Fantastic. So we can tag team because I know SEMA got a lot of calls on this also, right? So one of the things that sticks in my mind is the one resident, and yes, one does not make a trend, but even this person is extreme case of having water in the basement for 2 months because they didn't have any means of getting it out or paying to get it out. So that's one of the things is having a access to funding to immediately evacuate water that's in the basement adequately so that mold doesn't set in. That was a key problem. I know DC Water, through discussions with DC government, did step in to help, but there was a capped amount of $5,000. And while it may be adequate for some homes, it wasn't fully adequate for all homes. So the need exists to be able to get the water out to minimize damage. And with even the insurance, if you have to do that, you got to put the money up front, because 2 days is not 24 hours or 48 hours is not a quick enough turnaround time for the claims to be adjudicated. That was one major issue that I found out. Parmisha, do you have any other complaints that you can know of from the September 10th flooding where insurance would not have immediately helped?
No, I think that you provided that was a response that we received when we were doing our canvassing efforts. I did go out and I actually did speak to a lot of the residents, and of those that did that were able to remediate shortly after, this kind of help would have been beneficial. But one thing that I guess I just have questions about the approach, and I think that's where we were as a group kind of figuring out. But yes, that was some of the observations that we received from the residents, was that that immediate need was definitely needed. And then those that had the means were able to make that. And there was great concern by residents about those that did not have the means to make this happen. So there's a lot of community assistance from those who could help help neighbors was something that we observed as well.
Leo, can I just ask what specifically caused this flooding?
Inability to evacuate water from a particular area due to high intensity of rain that overwhelmed any systems that would be in place to get the water evacuated. 3 inches of rain in 2 hours is a lot of rain for a lot of areas.
Yeah. So this is all just the neighborhood basically being a bowl, and it's not overflowing or sewer backup. It's just an inability to take that much rain and disperse with it.
It was a combination.
Yeah, so it's actually both of those. So on the bottom right, these are homes near Watts Branch. So the Watts Branch tributary, actually overflowed and flowed onto the streets and into people's properties.
Okay.
And that is, primarily, that's because there was too much rain for the Watts Branch tributary to handle. So it goes into the floodplain, right? And so in those areas on the bottom right, those are in the known floodplain. A lot of the homes that we heard from, though, weren't in a mapped FEMA floodplain. There's no water body or water source close by, and it's kind of what you're saying, so which is maybe they're at their bottom of a street, and the water is kind of pooling there and ponding. But then there's the third issue that we had on September 10th, which is as the storm sewers filled up and folks didn't have backflow valves, then the water came out that way. So it's kind of a combination of multiple things.
Okay. And is there an impervious surface component? I know with Ellicott City, which was given as an example, a lot of the flooding was attributed to having paved over too much pervious surface. Is that an issue here as well, or no?
So, no, and I will beg to differ on Ellicott City also, because Ellicott City has flooded even before there was development. Historically, that area has flooded. The fact that they built shops in the flood zone is unfortunate. It's very picturesque. It's beautiful when it's dry, but historically, that area has flooded.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand. So insurance doesn't solve this problem, obviously. Is there also no infrastructure fix for this particular neighborhood or in Northeast DC?
You bring up an excellent point, and this is something we've been discussing. There are, and as I know DOE's got this IFM integrated flood model that they're going to be working on in the next several years, and it'll come up with options for infrastructure. But you're talking about $100 million plus projects, and the implementation is going to take years, measured in tens of years probably, and the relief needed is more immediate,
Okay.
which is where the insurance works as a stopgap until that happens.
Well, and I'll also add, Salil, maybe a good example is the Potomac Park levee system.
Yeah.
Right. So we've got a levee system. It's designed for the 100-year flood. But if there is a higher flood, it actually has to be pretty high to get even over the levee. But if there's a higher flood, that infrastructure is not going to help you. It's still going to flood, and you're still going to want flood insurance. And so one thing in the flood risk management world we're fond of saying is, like, you never have zero flood risk, right? If there's a big enough flood, if there's enough rain, you will eventually be flooded. So I think Salil is right. There's what do we do in between now and when we can build infrastructure? But even when we have infrastructure, it still may make sense for people to buy flood insurance. And just as an example, I can imagine a scenario where we identify a pipe that needs to be enlarged, and it might cost. I have no idea, but I'm just throwing out numbers. It might cost $5 million to do a 24-inch pipe. It might cost $10 million to do a 48-inch pipe. And somewhere you're going to make a decision about, is it worth the extra 5 million to get, to get the bigger pipe, which will reduce probabilities somewhat, but not, so you have to make all these decisions, but basically you're left with, there's still this residual risk at the end of the infrastructure implementation too. So I think it's just another reason why insurance is a piece of this, because even after infrastructure, you still would benefit from it.
Which is also internationally, there's a recognition that flood prevention is not possible. So they've changed the language to say flood adaptation. How do you adapt to the fact? The fact is we are going to flood. It's a fact of life. How do you minimize the damage by adapting to it? Coming back to this. Yes.
I'm sorry, Salil, this is Monty. I just wanted to break in for just a minute, just to give us kind of a time check. We are going to compress the rest of our conversations a little bit. So I just wanted to give an adjustment that we will stay in on these slides for another 2 minutes, and then we'll get into the larger conversation that has the high level ownership, the open discussion. And we'll spend probably 30 minutes on that as opposed to 50. So thank you, Salil.
Monty, thank you for keeping us on track. I'm going to start from the last bullet down there. This is what Verbesia and I talked about, which is there has to be immediate assistance so that you can prevent the mold from occurring. I mean, if this is like a $5,000 investment to clean up, a $6,000 investment that prevents $20,000 to $50,000 worth of mold damage remediation. Backwater valve, and there's been a whole lot of discussions on this issue with DCRA and the rest of the team here. This is an absolute necessary if you have fixtures below your road surface. At some point or the other, you're going to back up. Third bullet from the bottom, damage to structure and personal property. Interestingly, some portion of the overland flooding that people experienced was related to grading, grading around their property. Runoff coming from the roads, entering a private property, and flooding it, and then entering the basements. There's minimal investment. There's still an investment required, but minimal investment to prevent that or mitigate that. That's something that's low-hanging fruit, but it's property by property. And the last and the top one is residents without flood insurance. There has to be means to pay for it, and insurance is a vehicle for that. Any other points that we need to add to this that we need to do from the team?
I want to make sure.
Well, I think you covered it, but I'll just add just to put a highlight on it that it's important for people to know that a standard homeowners insurance policy or a water backup or sump overflow coverage endorsement do not provide protection against flood loss. So people come to DISB or other agencies and think that their standard homeowners insurance policy or a rider will cover the flood damage, and it doesn't. The other thing I'll just mention is that, as you mentioned earlier, it takes a significant amount of time to submit a claim, go through that process, and then receive a payout. And while that's going on, mold could be building and other things happening, which lead to a more expensive cleanup. So there's a time and an expense. And then oftentimes, if you talk about people having to be relocated, there's the alternative living expenses, which is very expensive as well. So all these things indicate that it's time consuming and expensive. And that's why these insurance products, or these new insurance products that we're thinking about creating, are very important.
Thank you, Philip. Great points.
So
Nick, were
real-
you going to jump in?
Yeah, I just, Philip, thank you for sharing that. Some things that came to mind just based off of what was shared is just having some level of messaging. I mean, I know we talk about this, but just if this does happen, what are my initial steps? Because when we were canvassing, if residents knew, okay, these are some of the things I need to have, or I need to be able to have access to that because I could go to the repair shop and make those quick cleanups, that the damages would be less if that's something that you kind of have to think through. And then also there's a lot of mailers from vendors stating that they could provide some level of sewer insurance, sewer backup insurance, and just understanding that market, like, is that, I don't know if that's how that plays in, but just who is a trusted source for that? Is that through my insurance, my home insurance, or is that something that I could do as a third party? Just some of that information about when you're getting this information as a resident. Is this like, how should this look? And I don't know if that makes sense, but that's just some of the questions that I recall looking through and wanted to share with the group.
Oh, great
I
point.
appreciate that. And then just one other topic is that people think about purchasing flood insurance when a storm is pending, right? And it's close. And it usually takes, on average, a flood policy goes into effect 30 days after purchase. So if you're looking at a storm is coming your way and you purchase a flood policy 5 days before the storm hits, whatever damage you incur is not going to be covered by that flood policy. So that's also something people should know, and oftentimes they're not aware of that.
Great points.
Yes, and in terms of purchasing a policy, you can purchase an NFIP policy through any district licensed insurance agent. So the same person who sells your homeowner's policy or your auto policy can also sell a flood policy.
Martin, was that you?
Yes.
Great. So
Even the sewer backup, because there are other vendors that are entering that market that are not ideal insurance providers. So that's just something to keep in mind.
So if we can purchase, if a homeowner can, I'm asking this through my ignorance, but the homeowner is going to have the same questions. So if this policy can be purchased through an insurance company, would two insurance companies provide the same dollar amount, or would two competing insurance companies have different rates based on how they assess the property?
For the NFIP policies, no. The premiums are set by FEMA.
Thank
One
you.
of the things that I think was interesting from something that Martin said earlier that I hadn't focused on, but I think it's relevant to what Monty was talking about, is it sounded like, Martin, you said that FEMA provide, or the National Flood Insurance Program policies provide coverage for things like sandbags, that presumably that's for, I mean, if you purchase sandbags prior to a potential flood, you could get coverage for those.
Yes, but only up to $1,000 per event.
Do you
Martin,
know what beyond, is it limited to sandbags, or is there other kind of stuff that one might purchase ahead of time to help mitigate the impact of the flood?
That's a good question. I can look up the specific policy documentation and send you the specific language.
It would be great to develop this information, run it, of course, by FEMA to make sure they agree to it, and then share it with homeowners on a site. So they're aware of it. There's a lot of stuff that you presented, Martin, that I wasn't quite aware of. I'm sure the same is going to apply to homeowners.
And I will say that I used to work in an NFIP state coordinator's office, and there were reports of policyholders having some challenges negotiating the claim for those flood emergency supplies. It's a little not quite as easy to document as, oh, my water heater is 3 foot deep in water, and take a picture of it and send it to the company. But I'll do some research into the documentation for that and look at the specific coverages.
Fantastic. I'm looking to the second line from the bottom. It doesn't help people to dry out the basements, which I keep harping on it because of the September 10th storm. But you have to dry out that basement in the first 48 hours. Otherwise, your damage is magnified because of the mold. So regardless of even if they have this policy, that's a need that needs to be met.
Yeah.
It was good discussion. Next slide.
So before we go into the next slide, I just want to make
Sure.
sure that because we're being mindful of time, that we're going to continue to focus on a shared goal for these for insurance and insurance conversations and other kinds of tools and instruments. So as you continue to go through these slides, I just want to make sure that folks are thinking in that way, and so that we have something to, as always, report out to the full task force. So thank you. Go ahead, Salil.
No, good point. We need to, from our last meeting, there's definitely a points raised that we need to whittle this down to key things that we need to focus on. Since there are many things we can focus on, but what can we do in the short term and medium term that's going to have a tangible impact? Okay, to this slide. A lot of people did not have insurance. Let's have a quick discussion on what the team thinks as to why. This is just a starter ideas. Any other points to add to this list? I know Philip talked about point number 4. They thought they were covered by homeowners policy. And I know that Disby got a lot of complaints about that. And we found out that they weren't covered.
Yeah, I think the only other thing worth pointing out, Salil, is just this top one, which is we make a big deal about FEMA flood insurance rate maps. And that's a very obvious, are you in the flood zone or you're not in the flood zone? And if you're in the flood zone, you should have flood insurance, right? That's easy. But almost a majority of the homes that flooded in September 10th were not even in a floodplain. And like I said, not even like next to a tributary or stream or anything. And unless there is neighborhood, like historical knowledge. You know, people are like, yeah, this, you know, when it rains, this area floods. Unless there's that getting spread around, people don't know that they're vulnerable. And so, you know, I think these lists that we've been kind of going through is just trying to point out, trying to help us get to an understanding of like, what are we trying to solve with this flood insurance? Because at least from the points that we've put up here so far, I don't think it's like, if you're just trying to get large cover, like something similar to the NFIP, like we have that, right? But it doesn't quite fit what the district needs. And so, no, actually, I think we can transition to the next slide. Like, I think we're just hoping to spend the rest of the time here getting input on of those things we mentioned, right? The affordability, specifically backflow type flooding. Like, what are the things that we would even want to address with insurance? Because I think the answer to that question is going to help us focus our efforts on whatever type of insurance product we need. So really, we just want to open it up to anyone kind of, we're trying to get the ideas here about what seems important, what should we be focusing on with whatever we're trying to do with insurance.
Hi, Nick. This is Sharon Shep. Good afternoon to everyone. I was just listening to the discussion and just had a couple of thoughts. One, what I would say is, it seems to me that it would be a better approach would be to tie flood insurance to the broader conversation around climate resiliency, as opposed to whether or not someone is in a flood zone, because there are people who are not, as you mentioned, are not in a flood zone, but their properties are flooding. And it may be that instead of focusing on just getting people to to purchase individual flood policies, that we have to maybe go more toward a community solution, as opposed to focusing on just individuals, and that might be a better way to go.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you for joining.
Sure.
Quick question, Salil. Is it fair to say that on September 10, 2020, there was not a high correlation between being in the 100-year floodplain and flooding? That seems to be what I'm hearing.
That is correct.
And Sharon, that's a great idea. And if I can push you a little bit on, when you think about community insurance, what are the things you would want out of the community insurance? Is it that you want everybody to be automatically covered so that we don't have to do some kind of outreach messaging? Or is it that you're hearing, that we need the ability to pay people quickly to cut out their drywall so that mold doesn't grow? Kind of what's the kind of key thing that you're thinking about with the community insurance?
Yeah, I don't know that necessarily the claim response time is necessarily pivotal to what we're trying to do, which is to protect people and save lives and protect property. And so it seemed to me that we have to get people to start thinking differently about flood risk, and not so much that it's related specifically to where their house is located, but that this is a peril that we're all vulnerable to. And so if we look at it as a community-wide vulnerability, then we want to look at a community-wide solution, if that makes sense.
And if I could just add to that, how would you In what form would that community solution be?
Well, I seem to recall that there were a number of products from, and I can't remember the entity that I believe had made some suggestions regarding some insurance products or insurance-like products, or we may want to call them risk mitigation products, or however you want to describe it, that we ought to take a look at to see, whether that would be a great fit. I mean, we would just have to look at a number of options and look at perhaps other countries or other jurisdictions that are using maybe some innovative solutions to address the same type of issue.
And I'll also say this is Philip, that one of the things I think Salil mentioned a couple of times, probably a key question that we need to answer. Are we looking for a solution to the immediate concern of drying out flooded areas, and then leaving it up to NFIP policies or private policies or whatever resources the policy or the homeowner may have otherwise to do repairs and whatnot? Or are we looking for something that's that may be either ancillary to the NFIP or substitute for the NFIP?
I think it's a great question. I mean, do you have any opinions?
Philip, if you don't mind, I can actually, if somebody will let me even share my screen, my Jane Waters and the fantastic team at RM kind of put some slides together so I could present it, or if I can't, when I try to hit share, I'm not able to get to that. But if I can get that feature added for me, great. And if not, I'm happy to just read through it, which kind of outlines some of those ideas.
Jess, we'll ask Stephanie offline. We'll ask Stephanie offline to let you share screen, okay?
I just passed it over to you. You should be able to share now.
Perfect. All right. So thanks to Jane and the team. Hopefully you guys can see it now. Everyone, is everyone?
Yes.
Great. So we just have like 6 slides or so. So these are just some ideas for potential solutions. So no, it's not set in stone, and I think there's a lot of tweaks that need to be made. But obviously, creating a viable mechanism, obviously we know it'll help the majority of folks in Ward 7 and 8. Obviously, you all know about transferring the risk, and a critical component of all the different strategies that we're trying to talk about. So our existing captive that we have provides medical liability coverage for currently 2 clinics. We used to have So Others May Eat and Bread for the City. They eventually got onto the federal programs, but we basically insure them for medical malpractice. So if any of their providers end up committing malpractice when caring for all vulnerable populations in the district, those suits would be filed, and then the district's policy would kick in. We've been collecting subsidized premiums from 4 clinics for many, many years. We're now down to 2. It's great if we had no clinics because they were able to provide for their own medical malpractice coverage, but not quite the case yet. In order to move to this flood captive, we'd have to have legislative changes. Obviously, the key benefits, the things that we're talking about evaluating, an immediate emergency payout. We're talking about whether or not, from a solution perspective, about residential property billing and going through the Office of Tax and Revenue, and also having licensing components, which would allow for automatic renewals. And would preclude us from doing a lot of the administrative chasing down of people paying for policies, but still has to be adequately managed. Obviously, it would ensure that there's property coverage in place for flood, And it would, of course, encourage good spread of risk, meaning not just that floods being covered in addition to all their other typical property coverages. So here at high level is kind of the flood captive insurance program. Obviously, we'd make it available to all district housing units, estimated around 322,000. We would offer reduced premiums, and we would hopefully be able to go through the real estate taxes program. I've worked with OTR and assessments for many, many years when I did real estate law for the Attorney General, and when I was at DCRA. And we could bill through that program, make sure that just like clean river charges or pilots for whatever different type of programs, we would estimate that if we could charge $300 per dwelling, we would also then want to, of course, then it'd be the administrative elements of following up with proof of adequate risk insurance, meaning that they also are covering their typical homeowners property coverages, which we know without a mortgage, as we discussed, there are potentially a lot of folks out there that don't even buy property insurance. So let alone flood, that would have to be another conversation. But we would need to, of course, have a significant number of dwellings, homes participate. And so if there was around 10,000 households, we would generate $3 million, which would be a significant amount of money to start building up the reserves. Obviously, if we're paying out $250,000 per home and there are lots of homes that are impacted, that $3 million would not last very long. But if year over year we create a fund, a sub fund within the captive insurance agency that I oversee, we would be able to build up enough reserves. We'd be filing, of course, with DSB to outline that. And then over the years, we'd have a lot more money available. In addition to that, and I think I'll get to that a little bit later, but we'll obviously be able to use that $3 million to then buy reinsurance and buy an annual policy that would help to create additional layers of coverage beyond just that $3 million. We would want, pardon me, homeowners to be in the DOEE established flood zones to participate in the program. We would also want homeowners who rent their properties be obligated to participate. It's kind of where we're getting back to that 10,000 initial participants. If we use, rather than NFIP flood zones, if we have the DOE established flood zones and all the great work that DOE is doing, we could work to make sure that that's occurring. And then through the licensing process, we could ensure that DCRA, that we're having a check and a balance, that as you get licensed to rent your property, that it's clear that you are establishing that this $300 payment in order to protect those renters and, of course, the property owners from flood concerns. Obviously, this policy would only trigger if the mayor declared a catastrophic flood stormwater event, which she could do for 2 homes or something greater, and we could establish the rules as for when the mayor would make those determinations. Coverage would assist homeowners who occupy the dwelling, or of course renters, as I discussed. And then happy to send it along, Monty, of course. The way that the payments would go about would be a household with 2 individuals dwelling there, be a $5,000 kind of emergency payment for that cleanup that would need to occur. Obviously, it gets to be a little bit trickier if they're renting and they're doing other things, getting ServPro or some type of entity in there to dehumidify and expel all of the water can still take some time, can be some issues, and it can be quite costly. So these numbers would have to be evaluated. We established that obviously a property with over 2 people living in the house, 3 or more, would be a $10,000 payment. So you just we'd have to be very thoughtful to think about, is it taking care of their alternative housing that they need, depending on the circumstance? Is it just repair and just emergency remediation? All those things need to be evaluated. And then similar to NFIP, a payout of up to $250,000 per dwelling with proof of the total insured value. Obviously, we want to make sure that the total insured value on their all risk policy exceeds $250,000. If it was something, it's $100,000 property or something that really doesn't establish over that, we wouldn't want to exceed the value of the property or exceed the value of the other policy. So obviously we at the captive insurance agency who buys insurance on behalf of the district or manages the already existing captive insurance program for medical clinics in DC, we would be the right agency to purchase reinsurance, to be a party to administer the program. Currently, we're only dealing with a couple of medical clinics, so it's very feasible and easy for us to manage and using our broker and managing that. Obviously, this becomes a true full-fledged insurance product when you have 10,000 participants in the program policyholders who may have claims. So it becomes a lot bigger of a process to administer. We would obviously need to have program funding in order to staff it properly and manage the operations, computers, all sorts of different things, contracts with any third-party brokers that we're working with, and the helpful placement of reinsurance. And then the other element that I would want to make sure people are aware of is obviously the second we issue policies or people participate in the program, we can be pursuing that reinsurance, but we don't know what that will shake out to be. We don't know what additional layers for $1 million, could we get an additional layer of 5 or 10 extra $1 million, and then the program's got $7 or $12 million available to it in the event that there's a major loss, a catastrophic loss. But those are things that we would have to talk about. And then also in the event that there were any claims filed in that first year before reinsurance is purchased, or we only have $3 million in reserves, right? In order to pay out those funds, it may become a situation where the district would have to come forward to pay out if something happens in the first year or two before reserves are really built up adequately, that the district and the taxpayers would have to fully fund the captive to make payments on the claims based on the program that we're high level identifying here. So it's kind of just some very rough ideas. Obviously, the whole of this could be limited, as we were just talking about, and it could be simply about emergency assistance, right? For $5,000 or $10,000 or $25,000, depending on certain circumstances, just in order to remediate, but not to rebuild, right? Just to make sure that there isn't mold continuing to diminish the value of the property and extenuating the situation to be worse than it actually has to be. So a huge shout out to Jane Waters and the rest of my team for putting all this together. Credits due there, but that's just generally kind of some of the ideas that we had. Could scale it back, could actually make it much more exhaustive in certain ways. We could try and figure out about having contractors who want to participate in our program, who we go through trainings and we educate them, and then they're on call in order to respond to losses when a participant is a partner in this program. So just a lot of those different elements that can be evaluated. So happy to send this to Monty and make sure everyone gets it, but just wanted to put it out there for some high level thinking around how we could establish a captive program.
Jed, thank you so much. That was great. And like Jed said, we will get a copy of that. We'll make sure it's posted onto the website, and all the members of the action team will get a copy of it. Great work to you and your team. It's a lot of detail. So, and even more to think about. But I think that we're honing in. The fact that you had something on paper to share is giving us, kind of the wherewithal to continue to move forward with, getting closer to some solutions to offer up as a proposed opportunity. So thank you. So we're gonna, Nick and Salil, I just wanted to check in with you all. We have about 15 minutes left. I know we have a number of things to discuss. We could just spend another 5 minutes rounding out the open discussion area for people to get some feedback and reaction to Jed's slides. I think that sounds best, but I want to leave it up to you to make sure that we at least get this conversation to a point where you feel like we have something to work with offline. So if you'd like, I would just, like to open it up for some feedback and comment to Jed and other things that have been talked about so far.
I agree. I'm blown away, Jed. Fantastic job there. Thank you,
Great. There
Kim.
was a question, Salo and Jed. There was a question from Emily. Emily, if you want to come off mute, you could read your own question, or I'd be happy to do it. Okay, well, Emily's her question was, are backwater valves uncommon or something that's expensive to install?
No, backwater valves are not expensive to install, especially if you install them during you're doing work in the basement, you're putting a bathroom in. Adding the backwater valve is just the cost of a backwater valve, which is absolutely minimal. If you have to go in after the fact, average price is around $5,800 in DC.
And
But-
Salo, I think that DC Water had a program for the backwater valves, right?
It still does. It's limited to the homes that flooded in September 10th or those in certain areas until the Northeast Boundary Tunnel is finished. It doesn't cover the entire city.
Okay.
I just wanted to piggyback on that. There are other things associated with that backwater valve installation, especially if it's in public space or if it's something that is underneath a street or paved area. A lot of individuals don't believe their front yard is actually public space. It's a lot more difficult to replace a backwater valve if it's in that location. Now, if you happen to be a lucky one and it's in the basement and it's accessed through your own property, yes, there is that benefit. But once it goes into public space, it does get there are other costs associated and other permits and reviews needed to replace that.
Chris, you bring up a good point, and it's not only public space, even if it's private property.
Yeah.
If you have to put a backwater valve outside a home, now you have to excavate all the way down to the bottom of the basement. And that makes not only installation, but maintenance difficult.
Very.
If you do it inside the basement, you only have a foot of excavation. There's a big difference. It's a big part of it is educational. When people put bathrooms in their basements to upgrade their basement into dwellings or another room, it's a lot easier for them to plan it with a backwater valve than come in afterwards. Jen, I got a quick question. It's a great presentation. And the last couple of sentences you talked about, this could be done either for an immediate assistance, like the $5,000, $6,000, $8,000 range, versus the full blown. From implementation perspective, is there a possibility of approaching this as a staged effort? First one, just to do it for an immediate relief, or we build out a much bigger program?
So thanks for the question, Salil. I think that it doesn't. I think that it's much the same. No matter what, we're talking about emergency assistance. I think that's the basic of every single effort. But whether or not somebody's eligible for that claim to then proceed to get the full $250,000 or some larger amount in order to rebuild, that's the second thought about it. It's the one and the same, though. You're still going to be filing a claim, right? And so you're getting a claim for emergency assistance, or you're getting a claim for emergency assistance and then monies to rebuild whatever damage occurred beyond the immediate remediation. One of the challenges, as government officials and as people are trying to figure out about helping people, clearly, I think the second is the better alternative, to be able to literally allow people to build back their lives. If we're just allowing people to remediate to make sure that it's not going to get worse, that's great. But if you can then no longer use that space because it was torn down to the studs and it's no longer a livable area or a usable area, it obviously diminishes the property value, and they just don't have the means or the wherewithal to rebuild it or get it back to where it needs to be. So I think that going for the bigger goal of it is great. The one thing that creates or causes is a lot more complexity. and a lot more evaluation, a lot more, boxes to be checked off. It's one thing for us to, issue some type of, whether it be a grant program. I mean, you could establish that this is simply a grant program and people apply for the grant and we issue a grant for them to remediate. We have the rules and the conditions about what they need to follow, just like DHCD has a senior home, stay in home property remodeling project, where you need to build some ADA issues. There's programs for that. It could be operated much the same. There's many different ways to skin the cat. But in order to really accomplish the full goal and really help our residents to the full extent, it would have to be, in my mind, you buy insurance to really put you back to where you were, not 20% of what the situation was. So, just again, though, it becomes a policy decision. Do we want to just give people enough money to be in a safe home, even though the lower part of their property they can't use as effectively, but it's safe? Or do we want people to be able to rebuild it to where it was? And those are some of the decisions. I see some of the questions to answer Stephanie's question about rental properties. I mean, there's always the possibility that a landlord could try and increase the rent, but it should be based on, the rental rules in the District of Columbia, whether it's a 4% increase is the most you can do or whatever it is, that's going to be what it's going to be. And if the landlord or the owner of the property says, I'm going to divide up this $300 over the monthly charge, rental rates are just determinant based on the marketplace. I don't think $300 is going to be a drastic change that a landlord is going to then directly pass that through to the renters. It's possible, but even still, that's just a number we threw out. It's possible that we're only talking about 5,000 properties and then maybe it should be $500 per person. This is just a high level formulation in order to get $3 million into the captive insurance agency fund for flood. So I don't know if that.
So is it I'm a little confused as to whether this is a voluntary program or a required program.
So yeah, the way it was envisioned, at least what we're putting out to Nick's question, the second one, is if we can establish this like clean city charges or some type of pilot or some type of fee that's applied through taxes, it's going to be 10,000 times easier than making it voluntary. If we don't receive enough money from policy, subsidized premium payments to spread that risk amongst all the parties that might be negatively impacted by a flood event, then it's obviously not going to be viable, right? If we only have 20 people participating in the program, unless the district taxpayers and the mayor and everyone decides we're just going to fund this program, we're going to put $5 million annually or $10 million annually, anything that gets depleted, any cost that we have to expend year over year, we're just going to re-up it in local dollars. The district can do that, but that has to be a budget decision that in order for it to truly be a captive, as I know all of my partners at Disney know, we got to create an insurance company. We're creating a pool of risk and we're gathering the money and we're building up enough reserves in order to pay out claims. And if we don't build up those reserves, we're not getting the money in, then clearly we're just talking about the district budgeting to pay for residents having flood events, plain and simple. And that could be the taxpayers doing it through the mayor saying, I'm going to establish a grant program and you have a flood event, you have these triggers, you come to me and I'll give you a grant for $10,000. You will need to hire a repair person and you'll need to do this, that, or the other. But the goal, the easiest way to collect that money is to make it a mandatory program that's done through real estate assessments and the taxes collected. That is the best way to do it. Or if DC water bills, adding it to people, adding it to DC water bills, which I'm not necessarily a proponent of as a DC water board member, but I will just say, those are the two ways to tackle it, to ensure that this is an automatic fee on an annual basis in order to require our residents who are not buying flood insurance to force everyone to do it at a very decreased amount and then creating some additional insurance product for them.
And thank you for answering like a rapid fire of questions. In fact, there are a few more in the chat. So what I'd like to do now is I've had a couple of offline questions asking, can we keep talking? So it's up to you all as a group. If we think that maybe if we put another, let's say 10 minutes on the table, is that okay? Can people stay? Most importantly, I think people that are been presenting and have and would be around to answer the questions. So that's the first question posed to the group. Can we put about 10 more minutes on the table for this conversation to continue, especially since it feels like we're kind of notching at something here that sounds like it's formulating for a district specific type of product or mechanism.
And I'm happy to stick around. So if there are any particular questions for me, the other thing, just so everybody knows, and Jane pointed this out to me, is that, we already buy flood insurance for all the district-owned properties. So just so you know, every district-owned building or leased building where we're the majority tenant, we have some flood coverage on those properties that we bought through our commercial commercial product for our commercial line of real property insurance. So we do some of that right now, but completely this is a different beast. It's a new captive program if we were to go forward, and this is what we had been talking about envisioning. And Meredith is 100% right that the number of participants is the most important factor. The more people we have, the cheaper, the less we can charge in order to get enough money to be able to go to the reinsurance marketplace and have appropriate coverage for all those that need to participate in the program.
So Jed, thanks for answering that question or comment made by Meredith. Just wanted to also know, Sil, if you want to come off mute and you can share your comment, and then after that, if Angela King can speak up, because we did have an intent of talking about the risk transfer mechanism versus insurance products. So maybe she could just touch on that. And I think that what we'll have to do is reserve the rest of the time and put into an agenda item for a conversation in our next month's meeting. So Sil, can you come off mute, state your question, and then Angela?
Quickly, I had asked Nick if DOE's flood modeling would project changes in flood zones as sea level rises. Anticipating that 10 or 20 years out, what's a flood zone or the priority flood zone today may be different. And his response was basically yes, that it will track both rising sea level and changes in precipitation.
Yeah, and just to add to that, what we're creating is something where we can go in, once it's created, we can go in and change variables. So we can say, show us what it looks like with 3 feet of sea level rise in 2080. Hit a button and you make a map. It'll probably take like a day to do it because you got to run all these models. But then we say, okay, show us what 4 feet of sea level rise in 2100 looks like, and then you create that map. So we'll have a lot of different ways to look at the data, but ultimately our intent is to be able to provide maps that show what is the 1% annual chance risk anywhere in the city from any type of flooding, and then that to me is the true flood risk. It's not really what is in the FEMA maps. So
I'm going to jump in, having seen some of the modeling work in the different cities around the country. One of the problems they have is they can't predict where the localized storm is. The typical model assumes a blanket rainfall across the city. That is not what's actually happening. You could have very localized storms, and it's almost infinite number of combinations. So the IFM is a fantastic tool, but we can't just hang our hat on it for everything. You just got to be aware of it.
And you and your team are going to be with us every step of the way, Salil. So you'll make sure we
absolutely
get it.
Absolutely.
Well, great. So it looks like actually, Ms. King, I think that what we should do, because I know when you start to talk about that risk transfer, knowing this group and how great your minds are, I think that we might get down a whole rabbit hole with that, because it's incredibly interesting. When we talked about it at our last meeting, we were all very intrigued about it. So why don't we put a reserve on that for our next action team meeting? And I'm looking at Nick and Salil for a thumbs up on that, to add that to a top agenda item for our major conversation. And then we'll also have to come back to some of these other things that we're talking about now too. So it looks like the agenda is populating itself as we speak. Are there any other thoughts, questions, or feedback for Jed and any of the others that have spoken today about what we've discussed?
Well, I'd actually like to pick up on the agenda for the next meeting. You know, for Jed and others, I mean, what would be useful? I mean, I know we've kind of talked offline about potentially getting you know, people in the insurance industry to talk about what they could do. You know, we could bring in some. We have connections with the Wharton School at UPenn, who does a lot of flood insurance stuff. Or, you know, do we want to learn about other potential options? You know, like we kind of teased the risk transfer thing, but there's, you know, catastrophe bonds and parametric insurance. How do you guys feel would be best to continue this conversation?
I mean, it's possible to ask a couple of the district's broker to be engaged, and they could come and speak a little bit about it. But I think also ultimately it's got to be the carriers in the marketplace who's got to make the decision about what types of specialized products or products they'd like to establish with the district. For instance, and not to go down a tangent, I know everyone's time is very valuable, but you know, the district has historically tried to create some specialized bond program in order to allow CVEs to participate in construction projects where they don't have to buy the full bond. And so the district has said, we will put up a large portion of the backing of this bond. Will you reduce bond rates in order for us to not have to have these CVEs pay the full amount? And unfortunately, the bond marketplace had no interest and wasn't, you know, said the bond rate's the bond rate. We're not changing it, no matter if the district's taking on 50% of that risk. And so I think it just, you know, it's basically, it would be stress testing the private marketplace. I think reinsurance is an easy thing. If we already have an insurance policy, being able to buy additional layers of coverage when we're already taking and absorbing that first layer of retention, that first layer of basically payouts, and we have the most risk in the game, people are willing to go on those higher layers. And so I think that's an easy sell. But going and talking about getting somebody from the insurance marketplace, whether Disby has contacts, whether we want to call upon carriers to come and speak to it, or maybe somebody at NAIC, you know, different people in the insurance industry to really speak to whether or not they could create some kind of specialized program for flood insurance. Ultimately, you know, unfortunately, a lot of all those wonderful statistics that we heard earlier about the NFIP and our participants not participating, you know, the carriers aren't in it to just do social service programs. That's really up to us and the government to do that, unfortunately. And so I am hesitant to believe that the insurance marketplace will really be able to step up and build a program of some kind that's voluntary, unless the district itself is putting up significant money to make it a viable business option. All the carriers are in it from, you know, they have to meet their shareholder expectations, and, you know, getting in a program where people are paying $300 premiums and the potential to pay out thousands of dollars and hundreds of thousands of dollars, it doesn't seem like it's going to be hugely viable. But I don't want to be a negative Nancy about it. And there are people who can speak to it. I'll just say that that's going to take a good deal of work to get those right parties to talk about it and analyze whether there's some type of viable program, that we really have to have some type of carrot for them to get engaged. So just wanted to, that's my overall thinking about what would the insurance industry do. I obviously welcome anybody from Disby who regulates that industry to speak on it, but that's kind of my initial belief on why it really does have to be a governmental program, given the lack of participation even in NFIP or anywhere else, and the low dollar thresholds that we're talking about.
Chad, thank you. Nick, I think that was a great question to ask. I think we'll have to take it offline a little bit probably just to make sure that we flush through the specifics on what we'll talk about next. But I would also like to propose that since this meeting was 90 minutes, that the next meeting should be probably a full 2 hours, just so that we're not feeling so pressed for time, because we're kind of like midway through, we're approaching that midway mark of meeting, and now we're getting into the meat and the substance. And the next thing we have coming up is our public outreach and public listening sessions. And so I'm sure even more will come from the public and what they experience in terms of the aftermath of a flood. Not even thinking about just the preparedness, but the aftermath and what kind of toll it takes on the public. So why don't we advance to our homework slide? We did have another question actually while she's pulling up the homework slide. Emily asked about the reasonable projected timeline for regulatory and legislative process that would be required to stand up something like a captive program. And I think what we'll do, Emily, is capture that kind of question, add it to our next meeting, and I think it'll be responded to well at that point, because we've kind of touched on it and we've talked around it, but just want to make sure that we captured that. Thank you. Meredith, I want to bring you up, let you go through the homework
Can we
assignments.
actually go back a couple slides? We want to go to the next step slide.
Okay.
This has homework in it too. Okay, so just real quickly, lots of great discussion today. So, we do have another action team meeting before the next task force. So we want to further development of these insurance needs and options. And then also the action idea list and categories that we talked about last month. We still have that. We've made a lot of changes to it. Nick sent out a link to it in an email just prior to the meeting or yesterday. So check that out. We've done some reorganization of the action idea list and how they're categorized. So please take a look at that and provide any comments on that. Monty mentioned the public listening sessions. And then the other big thing we wanted to talk about is the Flood Resilience Amendment Act. This is a good follow-on to the insurance discussion. So this is legislation that was introduced last fall, and there are two key things in this legislation. One is it allows DOE to designate areas of flood hazard in the district, essentially meaning beyond the 100-year floodplain, which is federally designated. And then the second is that it allows DOE to develop rulemaking to require flood insurance as a condition of occupancy. So what we're considering is getting the task force to vote on supporting this act so that can be shown as support for furthering these items. And so we'd like some feedback from the group. Doesn't necessarily have to be verbally today, but we're considering bringing this up at the next task force meeting. So Nick, is there anything you want to add on that?
Just to reiterate that what's in the legislation, so if the legislation is passed as is, nothing actually happens. It needs to then have a rulemaking, which is, then goes to a public comment process. And, it's specific to the insurance piece. We've actually, and the Director Wells has testified that, we don't actually plan to put any insurance requirements in the rulemaking unless there is a program or a way to make insurance affordable. So what the director is signaling is that, we do think it is useful to have the ability to have insurance requirements in general, but at this point in time, we wouldn't put it in a rulemaking because we feel like there are affordability concerns. So it's just a little more background, but I think the main ask is, I guess we'll follow up with an email but we'd like to hear, like, yeah, I mean, if you think this is something useful to bring up at the full task force, or if there's, particular question that you have about it, we're trying to, this is a good example of us trying to weigh how we use the flood task force for things like these that come up before the the action plans in November.
Nick and
Since
Meredith,
this item's already in progress, we want it to be able to continue. And DOEE releasing its revised flood regulations, which increase the regulated area to the 500-year floodplain, are waiting for this act to be passed.
so Nick and Meredith, do you see an ability to connect this to Jed's idea, which is a more affordable way, but requires everybody to buy in to make it really work?
Yeah, I think realistically it could go two paths. I mean, so the bill ultimately has to be marked up by council, and council could say they could just, they could pass the bill as is. They could put some kind of additional language in there saying we want to, we want you guys to establish some kind of insurance affordability program. I don't think the legislation would, pick how we're going to do it, but I think it could, kind of give even more weight to the efforts that we're doing.
Nick, if this captive, if it's something that goes forward, it has to have its own legislation, whether that's a part of this or it's a separate bill. It would need to have all the appropriate authority. There won't be a scenario where the council will say you need to create one. We would be prescriptive in establishing the specific authority and the specific details, and then there would be regulations that would follow after that.
Right. Yeah. So maybe, maybe that's something this task force can say, like, do we want to suggest to the council that they also consider it, a parallel legislation amendment? I don't know. It's kind of beyond my.
Yeah, I think that could definitely be a follow-up path. It's not, time-wise, I don't think the two are hinged together.
Right.
Okay. I was just trying to understand if they would conflict or would they support each other. I think what Jed said is they're independent.
Yeah, well, but I do think they would support. I mean, yeah, I think they would support.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the main thing to keep in mind at this point is that a lot of the construction that is in the floodplain may be new buildings, larger developments, and those they're going to carry flood insurance anyway. It's not going to be that's a additional financial burden, but we absolutely want to have that gap covered before any requirement is put out there.
Okay. All right. Well, I see that there's a number of folks dropping off, so I think that we'll probably have to whisk through. Do you want to go ahead and do the homework, Meredith, and then we can go ahead and adjourn the meeting?
We can just put the slide up. I don't think there's anything particular on that.
Okay.
Yeah, go two slides ahead. I think all of that is
not showing
things I've already said.
Sorry, it's loading. It's something happened on this and it's a little slow. There we are. It's still loading. Well, I think that this is
Anybody
just
else
time.
who wants to do some closing comments can.
Okay, well, for some reason it won't show up there. I think it's trying to get there. It says proposed public listing. Can you get to the next slide, which is the homework slide? It's
Yeah,
not
it just
advancing.
essentially says, give us feedback on this conversation, continue to look at the action plan ideas and scoring matrix, and also we will at some point be assigning individual agencies to work on these action plans. So be ready to step up when that comes.
Okay, there we go. All right, well, there it came up as soon as you finished it. Well, with that, we'll go to the next slide, which is the virtual meetings we have upcoming. On Friday, we have our Governance and Coordination Action Team meeting. If you'd like to join us, many of you are on both action teams, so that's February 11th at 9:30 a.m. And then we'll have our next month's meeting for this action team, the residential resilience, on March 8th at 2:30 p.m. We'll probably make that a time change for 2 hours, so it might be 2 o'clock. So please pay attention to the time difference when you get the notification. And then we'll have our flood task force meeting, the full flood task force meeting on March 16th. So March will be busy as usual. Since whenever we have all the meetings in 1 month, it gets to be pretty busy. So with that, I think that we've covered a lot of ground. We have a lot of great information. There's questions in the chat that we will answer probably at our next Residential Resilient Action Team meeting. And just want to thank everyone for participating and thinking about better solutions for the questions that we have unanswered. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.